At the check-in desk of the industry's biggest engineering awards gala, my son straightened his tie, smirked, and whispered, "Dad, don't embarrass us tonight. Just stay quiet and follow behind." My daughter-in-law laughed. "People like you don't belong with industry leaders." I didn't argue. I simply handed the hostess my invitation. She scanned the QR code, froze, then immediately turned to the chairman standing beside her. "Sir, our guest of honor has arrived." My son's smile disappeared before anyone said another word. "I'm grateful you're here for this one. Before we begin, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been underestimated by the people who should have known you best? Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to read today." Quick note: some details are fictionalized for reflection and storytelling. What matters most is the message at the heart of it all. Roxanne's voice cut through the polite dinner conversation, like a hairline crack appearing in load-bearing concrete quiet at first, but impossible to ignore once you'd seen it. That collar," she said, fork pausing midway to her mouth. She wasn't looking at me directly. Never did. "People will think we don't take care of you." I glanced down at my shirt. The collar was faded, sure. 40 washes past its prime, maybe more. But it was clean-pressed, perfectly serviceable. At 69, I'd spent 40 years finding cracks in structures before they collapsed: bridges, tunnels, high-rises. But I never expected the most dangerous fractures would appear at my own dinner table. Vernon's executive home in Winnetka gleamed under the crystal chandelier. Everything polished. Everything expensive. My son, 42, wore his CEO title like armor, expensive suit, polished cufflinks, the kind of confidence that came from believing your last name on a building meant you built it yourself. Across the table, my wife Opal set down her wine glass with the apologetic smile she'd perfected over 4 decades. At 65, she'd mastered the art of explaining to neighbors that her husband did some technical work, as if 40 years preventing structural failures was equivalent to filing paperwork. "I've told him a dozen times to let me buy new shirts," Opal said, turning the blame like a practiced hand. "But he never listens." Not defending, explaining. There was a difference. "Dad's always been practical," Vernon added, not waiting for my response. "Aren't you, Dad?" The question wasn't really a question. I folded my napkin, said nothing. Words at this table had the structural integrity of wet cardboard. They looked solid until you applied pressure. Lyle started to speak. My grandson, 36, had arrived earlier in a work truck with an electrician's toolkit and calloused hands, the kind of son who fixed things instead of taking credit for them, which his family mistook for lack of ambition. "Grandpa looks—" "Lyle, honey, would you pass the potatoes?" Roxanne interrupted, her smile as flawless as her makeup. At 38, she'd married ambition and expected dividends, designer handbag, perfect nails, and the particular ability to suggest cruelty over dinner without raising her voice. Lyle's jaw tightened, but he reached for the bowl. Across from me, Stellan, 8 years old, Lyle's son, watched the exchange with his grandfather's eyes, the kind that noticed things other people missed, like the way adults smiled with their mouths but not their faces. The boy hadn't said a word all evening. Smart kid. Vernon steered conversation toward quarterly earnings. Roxanne mentioned the country club's charity gala. Opal nodded along, laughing at the right moments, never once glancing my direction. I observed it all the way. I'd once documented hairline fractures in concrete methodically, without comment, noting which cracks would widen under stress and which structures were already too compromised to save. I'd spent 40 years finding the cracks in structures before they collapsed. I just never expected the most dangerous ones would be right here at this dinner table. An hour later, I drove home to Oak Park in my 15-year-old sedan. The radio didn't work. Passenger window stuck half open. But the engine ran clean, the frame was solid, and I'd replaced the brake lines myself 6 months ago. Some things you kept, because they still did what they were built to do. Saturday morning, Lyle's pickup truck pulled into my driveway just after 9. Rust spots, dented fender, 20 years of honest work visible in every scratch. "Morning, Dad." Lyle called, lifting his toolkit from the bed. "Brought Stellan. Hope that's okay." "Always." The boy climbed out carefully, small backpack over his shoulders. "Kitchen cabinet's been loose for 2 weeks," I said, leading them inside. "Thought I'd fix it myself, but your mother keeps calling about it." Lyle smiled. "She means well." "Did she?" I wasn't certain anymore. While Lyle worked on the cabinet, Stellan wandered into my study. I watched from the doorway as the boy's eyes went wide, rolled blueprints stacked in corners, structural models on every shelf, decades of documentation filling file cabinets. "What's all this stuff?" Stellan asked, running fingers along a scale model of a suspension bridge. "Projects," I said. "Old work." The boy explored carefully, respectfully, the way children do when they sense something matters. He picked up a bronze paperweight shaped like a building's foundation, examined the equations carved into a wooden ruler, traced the contour lines on a topographic survey. Then he stopped. "Grandpa," he lifted something from the bottom shelf. "Who are these people?" "You look important here." The photograph was black and white edges, worn soft from years tucked away. I recognized it immediately myself at 31, standing with 3 men in expensive suits before a massive bridge construction site. I was holding blueprints. The men were looking at me. "Old friends," I said, taking the photo gently. "That was a long time ago." "Were you building that bridge?" "Helping." "You look like you were in charge." Lyle appeared in the doorway, toolkit in hand. His eyes found the photograph over his son's shoulder. Something shifted in his expression, recognition maybe. Understanding. But he respected my privacy the way he always had. "Come on, kiddo," Lyle said quietly. "Let's finish that cabinet before lunch." Stellan nodded, glanced once more at the photo in my hands, then followed his father out. I stood alone in the study, looking at the young man I'd been. The bridge in the background had carried traffic for 37 years without incident. Load-tested, stress-verified, built to outlast the men who designed it. My grandson looked at that photograph the way engineers look at blueprints, trying to see what was built, not just what remained. I set the photo back on the shelf, face down this time. Later, after they'd left, I stood in the driveway looking at Lyle's old pickup. Rust spots and dented fender, speaking of 2 decades honest work. The truck had carried 6 engineers out of a hillside collapse site 20 minutes before the retaining wall came down. I'd kept it because some things you don't replace just because they look old. Some things carry weight that has nothing to do with appearance. By the following week, I'd see my son's name in the newspaper, praised for innovation I'd spent 2 decades protecting. But I didn't know that yet. The headline appeared on page 3 of the Construction Industry Journal Tuesday morning, October 17th, innocent black ink on newsprint that somehow felt like reading my own obituary, written by someone who'd never bothered to check if I was actually dead. Prescott Engineering unveils breakthrough seismic reinforcement system. I read the article twice. First pass quick, second pass slow, the way you'd inspect a load-bearing wall after someone reported hearing unusual sounds, looking for the crack. Found it in the 3rd paragraph. The system employs triaxial load-sharing nodes to distribute seismic stress across multiple structural pathways, creating redundant load paths that maintain integrity even during catastrophic ground movement. This breakthrough in structural resilience engineering represents a paradigm shift in high-rise safety architecture. Triaxial load-sharing nodes, redundant stress path modeling. I wrote those phrases in 2004. Every word, every hyphen. The research paper had taken me 8 months evenings after site inspections, weekends, when Opal thought I was watching football, I'd submitted it to the American Society of Civil Engineers, presented findings at their annual conference in Denver. 23 people attended that presentation. Vernon wasn't one of them. The article continued praising Vernon as lead developer of the innovation, quoted him discussing the years of dedicated research that went into the system, mentioned a multi-million-dollar contract with a commercial developer for implementation in Chicago's new waterfront district. I set the newspaper down carefully, the way you'd set down something fragile that you're trying very hard not to break. My coffee had gone cold. Through the kitchen window, October sunlight caught the edge of my study door left half open. Inside, rolled blueprints lined the corner. Technical documentation filled 3 file cabinets. The original research paper sat in a manila folder marked ASCE 2004 Seismic Load Distribution. All of it still there. All of it gathering dust while my son put his name on my work and called it breakthrough. Breakthrough, I said aloud to the empty kitchen. The word came out wrong, half laugh, half something else. I folded the newspaper along its crease, set it beside my plate, and stared at Vernon's photograph above the article. Professional headshot, confident smile. The caption identified him as innovator and industry leader. In structural engineering, we have a term for the moment when invisible stress becomes visible damage, progressive collapse. One failure triggering the next, widening the cracks until the whole system comes down. I could feel something starting to crack, but I said nothing, did nothing. Just cleared my breakfast dishes, rinsed the plate, and went about my day as if I hadn't just discovered my son was a thief. A week later, Vernon called. Dad, I'm having some colleagues over to the office Friday afternoon, informal thing celebrating the waterfront contract. You should stop by, meet the team. He'd never invited me to his office before. I went. The building was downtown, 43rd floor, panoramic view of Chicago, stretching toward the lake. Glass walls, polished marble, the kind of place where even the elevator buttons felt expensive. Vernon met me in the lobby wearing a suit that cost more than my monthly mortgage. Glad you could make it, he said, shaking my hand like I was a client. Come on up, everyone's eager to meet you. Were they? The conference room held maybe a dozen people. Engineers, project managers, a few executives I didn't recognize. Wine cheese plate, the polite hum of professional networking. Vernon guided me toward a man in his mid-40s, graying at the temples, wearing a tie, but looking like he'd rather not be. The kind of engineer who still remembered what it meant to respect the people who came before. Derek, this is my father, Vernon said. He did some technical work back in the day. Mostly inspections, right, Dad? 4 decades. Chief structural engineer on projects that still carried traffic, still housed families, still stood exactly where they were built, because I'd made certain they wouldn't fall. Mostly inspections. Derek Hastings, Vernon's senior project manager, according to the nameplate on the desk nearby, extended his hand. Mr. Prescott, pleasure to meet you. What kind of projects did you work on? Always interesting hearing about the old methods. Old methods. I opened my mouth to answer. Started to explain about the bridge work, the tunnel reinforcement, the high-rise retrofitting that prevented. Dad loves talking about the past. Vernon interrupted, smoothly smiling, one hand on my shoulder like we were close. But we should probably focus on the future, right? Speaking of which, anyone golfing this weekend? Conversation shifted. Derek nodded politely, turned toward someone asking about tea times. Vernon drifted away to refill his wine glass. I stood there, half-sentence dying in my throat, watching my son erase me with practiced ease. How many times had he done this, introduced me to people who mattered, then made sure I didn't? I moved toward the windows, pretending to admire the view. Gave myself distance from the conversation, from Vernon's performance, from the careful architecture of my own irrelevance. That's when I saw it. On the conference room wall, between the framed awards and glossy project photos, someone had mounted a technical diagram. Large format, maybe 30 inches wide, printed on clean white drafting paper. Load distribution schematics. Triaxial nodes rendered in precise blue ink. Stress path modeling, laid out in the exact configuration I'd developed 20 years ago, hand-drawn at my kitchen table while Opal slept upstairs, and the house creaked in the winter cold. I crossed the room, slowly, wineglass forgotten in my hand. Up close, the diagram was perfect. Every line, every notation, every calculated load value exactly as I'd drawn it. The signature block in the lower right corner was too small to read from where I'd been standing. But now, blank. No name, no date, no attribution. Just the work stolen clean mounted on my son's wall like a trophy. Beautiful, isn't it? Vernon appeared beside me, following my gaze. That's the core schematic for the waterfront project. Took our team months to develop. Months. I looked at my son. He looked at the diagram. Neither of us looked at each other. Yes, I said quietly. Beautiful. From across the room, I couldn't read the signature block in the corner, but I didn't need to. I'd drawn those lines myself by hand in the winter of 2004. Something inside me cracked a little wider. It took me 3 hours to spread every blueprint across my study floor. 20 years of rolled paper unfurling like evidence at a crime scene, which I suppose it was. Late November. Nearly midnight. Yellow desk lamp casting shadows across technical drawings I'd sketched by hand in 2004, back when I still believed the work mattered more than whose name appeared in the signature block. Beside the originals, I'd laid out Vernon's company documents, downloaded from public permit filings, project specifications, submitted to the city technical summaries, published in trade journals. The River North residential complex. 15 stories, 140 units. Occupancy approved 6 weeks ago. I started with the load distribution schematics. Triaxial nodes exactly where I'd placed them. Stress path modeling precisely as I'd calculated. Even the unusual corner support configuration I'd spent 6 months testing there, it was replicated perfectly in Vernon's documents. Perfect theft, clean copy. Then I looked closer. Section 4.7 Primary Structural Reinforcement. My original blueprint specified 8 tie rods per support column, grade 572 steel redundant stress distribution across dual pathways. The kind of over-engineering that kept buildings standing during earthquakes nobody expected. Vernon's version read, Section 4.7 tie rod configuration optimized for material efficiency. Optimized. I pulled the detailed specifications, counted the tie rods listed in the as-built drawings. 4 per column. Half what the design required. Optimized meant deleted. I moved to the sensor array documentation, the backup stress monitoring system I designed to detect structural fatigue before it became visible cracking. 12 sensor stations hardwired to central monitoring real-time data analysis. Vernon's specifications listed 0 backup sensors. The entire monitoring system absent from equipment lists, cut from the budget, erased from the safety architecture, like it had never existed. I sat back on my heels, blueprints spread around me like accusation. The design wasn't just copied. It was broken on purpose. My hands were shaking. I made them stop. For the next hour, I documented every deviation, every missing component, every place where Vernon had kept my sophisticated load calculations, but deleted the expensive safety systems that made those calculations work. Primary tie rods reduced by 50%. Redundant sensor array eliminated entirely. Backup stress monitoring system removed from specifications. Emergency load path redundancy simplified to single pathway design. He'd kept the architecture that let him build tall and cheap. Cut everything that kept people safe. In 40 years of structural inspection, I'd written hundreds of reports documenting failures, but I'd never had to document one before it happened, knowing exactly whose signature should have prevented it. I checked the permit timeline. Construction completed September 2023. Occupancy certificate issued October 12th. Current residential status full occupancy 140 units families with children. 140 families living inside a building, held up by half the safety margin it needed. I whispered it aloud to the empty room just to hear how it sounded. 140 families. The permit said 140 families are already living inside it. The words didn't sound better spoken. I was still sitting there surrounded by evidence when I heard the knock. Lyle let himself in through the kitchen door. He had a key, used it when he came by to fix things Opal kept calling about. Faulty outlet this time. Said he'd stop by after his evening job. His voice carried from the hallway. Kitchen lights on. You still up? In here. He appeared in the study doorway, toolkit in hand, and stopped. Blueprints covered every surface. Technical documents arranged in careful rows. My laptop still open to the city's permit database. What's all this? He asked quietly. I looked at my grandson. 36 years old. Good man. Honest work. Never took credit for things he didn't build. Your brother's latest project, I said. Comparing specifications. Lyle set down his toolkit, stepped carefully between the papers, and picked up one of Vernon's technical reports. Or River North Complex, he read. Then his expression shifted. Dad, I ran the electrical for this building. These backup power numbers, they don't match what I installed. I waited. He flipped through pages, frowning. Says here's 0 backup sensors. But my work orders 3 months ago required conduit runs for 12 sensor stations. I installed every mount. Told me at the time they'd add the sensors later, phase 2. He looked up. There was never going to be a phase 2, was there? No. They're not supposed to match, I said carefully. Your brother cut the backup systems to save costs. Lyle went very still. The kind of still you get when you realize the problem is bigger than you thought, the way engineers look at cracks that shouldn't be there yet. How much did he cut? I handed him the comparison sheet I'd compiled. Watched him read through the list. Watched his face pale as he understood. Jesus, he said softly. The building opened last month. Full occupancy. Families with kids. I know. Does Vernon know it's compromised? He signed the specifications. He knows exactly what he cut. Lyle set the paper down like it might catch fire. What are you going to do? Good question. Report it to the building department. They'd ask how I obtained proprietary specifications. File a formal complaint. Vernon would deny everything. Claim I was a disgruntled father making accusations I couldn't prove. Go public and I'd destroy my son's career, maybe his life, assuming I could prove the theft in the first place. But 140 families were sleeping in bedrooms supported by calculations my son had cut in half. Cooking dinner beneath ceiling joists that should have had twice the reinforcement they carried. I don't know yet, I said. Lyle looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded. Whatever you decide, he said quietly. I've got the original work orders, dated, signed, proof they planned for systems they never installed, evidence from someone Vernon couldn't dismiss as bitter or confused. Keep them safe, I said. He picked up his toolkit, fixed the outlet, didn't mention the blueprints again. After he left, I sat alone with the evidence spread across my floor. The design wasn't just copied, it was broken on purpose, and 140 families were already living inside it. The Evanston Public Library closed at 9 p.m. on Tuesdays, which gave me 90 minutes at a public computer terminal where nobody would connect the IP address to my name, my house, or my son. I arrived at 7:30. Chose a terminal in the back corner away from the circulation desk. Opened a blank document and started typing. Just the anonymous structural safety report, River North Residential Complex, 847 North Franklin Street, Chicago, Illinois. Early December. The building had been occupied for 6 weeks. Every day I delayed was another day those families lived beneath calculations that didn't add up, supported by steel that wasn't there. I documented everything. Section 4.7, Load Distribution, 8 primary tie rods, specified in original structural calculations. 0 installed, per current as-built documentation filed with city permits. Seismic stress redistribution will exceed remaining structural capacity by estimated 240% during moderate ground movement to every missing component, every deleted safety system, every place where Vernon had kept my architecture but cut the engineering that made it work. The backup sensor array, 12 stress monitoring stations specified in design phase 0 installed per equipment inspection records. Progressive structural fatigue will be undetectable until visible cracking indicates imminent failure. I wrote for an hour. 8 pages. Technical language precise enough that any qualified engineer would understand the danger detailed enough that the building department couldn't ignore it. Emergency load path redundancy eliminated. Single pathway design creates catastrophic failure risk. Under seismic stress exceeding 4.2 magnitude progressive collapse, probability approaches certainty. I read it through twice. Made sure I hadn't included anything that would identify me, no personal references, no mention of original authorship, nothing that pointed back to the father whose work had been stolen and broken. Just the facts, just the danger. Just 140 families who deserved to know the building they lived in wasn't safe. The Chicago Building Department had an anonymous safety portal. Secure submission, confidential review. I'd used it twice before reporting violations I'd witnessed on projects where speaking publicly would have cost me contracts. The system had worked both times. Investigations opened, problems fixed. Nobody ever knew who'd filed the complaint. I believed the system would work again. Submitted the report at 8:43 p.m. The confirmation screen promised confidential review within 10 business days. Anonymous status protected under city whistleblower ordinances. I cleared the browser history, logged out, and drove home. By 8:57, I was sitting at my kitchen table with my engineering journal open, the same leather-bound notebook I'd kept for 40 years, documenting every site inspection, every safety concern, every report filed. I wrote carefully the way I always had. December 5th, 2023, 1934 hours. Anonymous structural safety report submitted to Chicago Building Department regarding River North Residential Complex. 8-page technical analysis documenting load path deficiencies, equipment specification violations, progressive collapse risk assessment. Submitted via Department Secure Portal. Report contains no identifying information. Purpose: protect occupant safety, trigger mandatory inspection protocol. 40 years I'd logged investigations this way. Professional discipline. Complete documentation. Evidence that I'd done my job, followed procedure, reported dangers through proper channels. I'd spent 40 years believing the system worked, that if you documented the cracks, someone with authority would fix them before people got hurt. I didn't know yet that some cracks run deeper than the buildings. 2 days later, Vernon's office phone rang at 10:17 a.m. I wouldn't find out about that call until much later. Wouldn't know about the conversation, the forwarded email, the betrayal that happened while I sat at home waiting for the building department to do its job. But I can piece it together now. From documents filed later, from testimony given under oath, from the paper trail that revealed exactly how the system failed, Glenn Whitlock called that morning. Senior plan reviewer at Chicago Building Department, 23 years in the office, comfortable salary, comfortable pension, waiting at retirement. Also comfortable with the consulting fees several developers paid him under the table, early warnings about anonymous complaints in exchange for cash that never appeared on any ledger or tax return. Vernon's phone buzzed. Whitlock's name on the screen. "Morning, Glenn. What can I do for you?" "Courtesy heads up, Vernon. Anonymous complaint came through the portal Tuesday night. River North project. Technical stuff, structural concerns. Figured you'd want to know before it hits official review. Send it over. Already in your inbox, marked confidential." Vernon opened his email. Found the PDF. Started reading. Section 4.7, Load Distribution, 8 primary tie rods specified in original calculations. His hands went still on the keyboard. Triaxial load-sharing nodes, redundant stress path modeling, progressive collapse coefficient. He'd seen that language before. Read it in papers scattered across his father's study. Heard it in presentations at industry conferences when the old man thought nobody was listening. Every phrase, every technical term, every way his father had described structural failures for 4 decades. "Dad wrote this," Vernon said aloud to the empty office. "Nobody else uses that language." He picked up his cell, dialed Roxanne. She answered on the first ring. "What's wrong?" My father filed an anonymous complaint about River North. Building department just forwarded it. Silence. Then, "How do you know it was him?" "The language. Triaxial nodes, stress path modeling. It's his fingerprints all over the report." "Monorzai, does he have proof?" Roxanne's voice went cold, calculating. "Original blueprints. Calculations, anything with his signature." Vernon looked out his office window at Chicago, spreading 43 floors below. "Quick, everything's probably still in his study. He never throws documentation away. So then we need him to sign something before this report goes anywhere official," Roxanne said. "Consulting agreement, advisory role, something that puts his name on the modifications." "He'll never sign. He will if your mother asks him the right way." I found out later, much later, that the report had been forwarded to his office within 2 days. By then, they were already preparing the paperwork that would turn my warning into my confession. Vernon recognized every phrase, every technical term, every way I'd described load path failures for 4 decades. The anonymous report I'd sent to protect 140 families had reached my son's desk in less than 48 hours, and he was already calling his wife to discuss how to make sure that, if the building failed, my name, not his, would be on the investigation report. I found out about my wife's betrayal, the way you find most structural failures, not when they happen, but months later when you're investigating something else, and discover the crack that started everything. I didn't know about the forwarded report yet. Didn't know Vernon had recognized my language within hours. Didn't know he was already planning how to shift the blame. I was still waiting for the building department to respond, still believing the system worked. That belief lasted until I started tracing the timeline backward. When did Vernon first have access to my blueprints? Not in October when I saw the diagram on his wall. Not in September when construction finished. The theft had to go back further years, maybe. I sat at my kitchen table with a calendar and started working backward through memory. Summer 2023. Vernon had stopped by the house, said he needed help finding old land survey documents for a property line dispute. Asked if he could check my filing cabinets. I'd said yes. Told him to check the 3rd drawer. That visit lasted 40 minutes. I'd been in the garage organizing tools. When I came back inside, Vernon was leaving, thanked me for the help, said he'd found what he needed. I thought nothing of it. But now, December, January, knowing what I knew about the stolen work, I called Opal. "When Vernon came by last summer looking for land documents, were you home?" "Now what?" Her voice carried that particular irritation of someone interrupted during something more important. Why would I remember that? July or August. He was in my study for a while. Silence. Then, "I might have been here. Why does it matter? Did you let him in?" Another pause, longer this time. "He called ahead," she said finally. "Asked if your old research files were still in the study. Engineering designs from before he was born. I told him yes, you never threw anything away. He came by the next week." My hand tightened on the phone. "You told him about the blueprints." "I mentioned you had old work. That's all." He said he wanted to understand what his father had done before he was born. But the tone was wrong. Defensive where it should have been confused. "Where were you when he was in the study?" "I don't remember. The hallway, maybe." I didn't go in. You hate when people disturb your organization. She'd stood in the hallway, watching, neither helping nor questioning when her son spent 40 minutes alone with file cabinets and a copy machine that sat on the desk by the window. She didn't enter, didn't stop him, didn't ask what he'd copied. Silent complicity that enabled everything. You knew, I said quietly. Click. She'd hung up. I set the phone down carefully. 41 years of marriage. 41 years I'd trusted her with everything, including the room where I kept the work that mattered most. In structural engineering, we call it a pre-existing condition damage that happened long before the visible failure hidden in the foundation, where nobody thought to look until it was too late. The betrayal wasn't passive ignorance. It was active orchestration. She'd told Vernon about the blueprints, created the opportunity, then maintained plausible deniability by staying just outside the door. Co-conspirator, not bystander. I sat there for a long time, thinking about foundations that looked solid until you tested the weight they carried. Then I thought about something else, something older. Winter 2004, 20 years ago. The original research that Vernon had stolen and broken. I remembered that project clearly. The one that should have made my career. The one I'd walked away from instead. Midwestern Engineering Solutions. Executive Office. Richard Dunmore behind his desk, Senior Vice President, 30 years reducing structural calculations to cost-benefit analyses, the kind of executive who measured safety in insurance premiums rather than lives saved. I'd been 49, spent 6 months developing the load distribution system. Triaxial stress sharing that improved seismic resilience by 43% over conventional design. Innovative, effective, expensive. Dunmore had listened to my presentation, examined the blueprints, run the numbers. Impressive work, he'd said. But we need modifications. What kind? 15% cost reduction. Eliminate the redundant tie rods, simplify the sensor array, cut the backup monitoring system. The architecture still works. You keep most of the royalties, everybody wins. I'd looked at the contract he slid across the desk. $340,000 plus implementation fees. Enough to pay off the mortgage fund Lyle's college set aside retirement money. All I had to do was sign my name to a version that cut the safety margins that justified the entire system. It works until it doesn't, I'd said. Those redundant components are the difference between a building that flexes and a building that collapses. I won't sign my name to the modified version. Dunmore's expression had gone cold. Then we're suspending the project indefinitely. I'd taken the original blueprints home that evening in a cardboard tube. Integrity intact. Career opportunity dead. Opal had been furious when I told her. Called me stubborn. Said I'd put principles ahead of our family's security. Stopped speaking to me for 2 weeks. I thought she'd been angry about the lost money. Now I understood she'd been angry about the choice itself, the decision to say no when someone with authority told me to compromise. What do you call it when the decision that defined your integrity becomes the blueprint for your son's corruption? 20 years ago, I'd walked away from a 6-figure contract rather than put my name on something that could hurt people. Last Tuesday, my son had walked into a black tie ceremony to accept an industry award for it. Same design. Same cost cuts I'd rejected on principle. Same safety margins I'd refused to compromise even when it cost me everything. Vernon had found those blueprints, made the exact modifications I'd refused, called it innovation, and accepted applause. I hadn't been invited to the ceremony. Hadn't known it existed. The blueprints I'd refused to compromise in 2004 became the innovation my son celebrated in 2024. Same design, same cost cuts I'd rejected, same safety margins I'd walked away from a career opportunity to protect. He'd done everything I'd refused to do. Put his name where mine wouldn't go. Accepted an award in front of 300 people who would never know the man who'd originally drawn those lines had said no. And somewhere in a high-rise overlooking Chicago, He was preparing documents that would make it look like I'd approved those compromises all along. They arrived on Sunday at 2 p.m. Vernon, carrying a leather portfolio like he was closing a business deal, Roxanne wearing the smile she saved for people she was about to manipulate, my wife, holding the door open, as if she'd been expecting them. She had been. I was reading the newspaper at the kitchen table when they walked in. Opal's voice from the entryway warm and welcoming in a way she hadn't sounded toward me in months. Come in, he's just having coffee. Vernon appeared first. Sunday casual polo shirt, pressed khakis. Dad got a minute. Need you to look at something quick. Technical formality for the insurance company. Roxanne followed, carrying a leather folder thick with documents. Set it on the table, opened to reveal maybe 20 pages of legal text. Placed a pen beside it. Standard liability language, Vernon said. Insurance requires signatures from all structural consultants. You know how it is, lawyers making paperwork for paperwork's sake. I looked at the document, then at my son. I wasn't a structural consultant on your project. Technically, you were, Roxanne said, leaning over the table, finger pointing to a signature line. Any engineer who provides input during design phase counts as a consultant. Just sign right here at the bottom. Everyone involved has already signed their copy. She positioned herself, blocking full view of the text, making thorough reading physically awkward. I moved the folder 6 inches left out from under her shadow. I'll read it first. It's just boilerplate, Vernon said. 20 pages of legal language. You'll be here all afternoon. Then I'll be here all afternoon. I started reading, slowly, line by line. The way I'd read structural specifications for 40 years, not trusting summaries, checking every detail before putting my name on anything. Page 1, project identification. Page 2, insurance policy references. Page 3, consultant roster. Roxanne shifted her weight. Vernon checked his watch. Page 4. There, buried in paragraph 7, subsection C, formatted identically to surrounding administrative language. Undersigned consultant acknowledges advisory role in structural modification approvals for River North residential project, accepting professional responsibility for design adequacy and compliance verification. Signatory assumes liability for structural specifications as reviewing engineer of record. I read it 3 times. The document wasn't asking me to verify technical details. It was retroactively establishing me as a consulting advisor who'd approved Vernon's modifications. Every safety system he'd cut, every tie rod he'd eliminated, every sensor array he'd deleted, all of it would become my responsibility the moment I signed. If the building failed when it failed, my name would be on the investigation report as the engineer who'd certified the compromised design. Civil liability, criminal negligence, professional license revocation, all transferred from Vernon to me with one signature. I set the pen down deliberately. If this is just a formality, I said quietly, why does it need my signature at all? According to your company's public documents, I was never a consultant on this project. Vernon looked at Roxanne for just a second. The way structural engineers glance at each other when a building makes a sound it shouldn't right, before they evacuate everyone and call it in. That micro-glance confirmed everything. Insurance requirements, Roxanne said, the voice still smooth but smile tightening. Anyone who had access to design materials has to sign disclosure forms. I never had access to your design materials. You have the original research, Vernon said. The system's based on your old work. Insurance says that counts as consulting contribution. Almost convincing. If I hadn't already known about the theft, the forwarded report, Glenn Whitlock's betrayal, I might have believed it. I'll need my own attorney to review this before signing. Roxanne's smile vanished. That's really not necessary for standard paperwork. Then you won't mind waiting while I get a legal opinion. Vernon closed the folder, picked up the pen. We'll come back another time, he said. When you've had a chance to think about it. They left within 2 minutes. Opal walked them to the door, spoke in low voices I couldn't hear, then returned without meeting my eyes. You should have just signed it," she said, always making things more difficult than they need to be. She went upstairs. I sat alone with the memory of that document's language. 9 p.m. Lyle showed up to fix the kitchen outlet. While he worked, I heard him in what used to be Opal's home office area, the small desk with the household printer. "I will not." His voice carried uncertainty. "You need to see something." He was holding papers, face pale. This was in the printer tray. Draft version of what they brought you today. Same document, same liability language. But this copy had handwritten annotations in red pen along the margins. Page 4 beside the consultant acknowledgement clause. Liability transfer if structural failure, all civil/criminal responsibility flows to signatory as approving engineer. Page 7 next to the signature block. Establishes dad as consulting advisor retroactively. Legal shield for V if building fails. They'd printed a practice version. Made notes outlining exactly what they were doing. Then printed a clean copy and brought it to my house with smiles and lies about insurance formalities. Lyle pulled out his phone, took 3 photos, full document liability annotation, close-up signature block with handwritten notes. "Sending these to you," he said, "in case they try to destroy the original." The message came through at 11:47 p.m. 3 photos. I looked at them for a long time under the bedroom lamp. Liability transfer clause establishes dad as consulting advisor retroactively. They'd written it down, put it in writing. Proof the framing wasn't defensive panic, but premeditated strategy. I opened my nightstand drawer. The audio recorder sat where it had rested for 3 years since my last official investigation. Small digital device, 40-hour battery, voice-activated recording. I'd carried it through 37 structural failure investigations, bridge collapses, tunnel emergencies, parking structure near misses. It had documented 3 buildings I'd helped save, and 1 I hadn't gotten to in time. Tonight, I pulled it from the drawer, checked the battery, and placed it in my jacket pocket for the 38th investigation. This one was different. This one was happening before the failure, not after. The recorder was smaller than a deck of cards. Black metal casing worn smooth at the corners from 4 decades in my jacket pocket. Red LED that still lit up when you pressed record, battery compartment that somehow still held a charge after all these years. Late January, past midnight. I sat at my study desk under the yellow lamp, same lamp I'd used to review blueprints for 40 years, and tested the device I'd never imagined using for this. Pressed the power button. Red light blinked on. Spoke clearly toward the small microphone grid. January 15th, 2024, 23:17 hours. Device operational check. Audio clarity test. Pressed stop. Pressed playback. My voice came through clean, no static, no distortion. 4 decades old, and the thing still worked perfectly. I'd carried this recorder through 40 years of structural failure investigations, legal dispute meetings, expert witness depositions, 300 hours of recorded testimony that had been admitted in court cases, insurance settlements, professional licensing hearings, authenticated evidence, chain of custody established across 37 separate investigations, which meant anything I recorded now would carry the same legal weight. Expert witness credibility. Professional documentation that couldn't be dismissed as amateur recording or manipulated evidence. 40 years of discipline about to become a weapon I'd never intended to forge. I picked up my Navy jacket from the chair, the one I wore to every site inspection, every professional meeting, every investigation. Found the breast pocket where the recorder had lived for most of its operational life. Slipped the device inside. Perfect fit. Same pocket-shaped indent worn into the fabric over 4 decades. The recorder settled into place like it had never left. Investigation 38. I said aloud to the empty study. First time I've ever had to document my own family. In 37 previous investigations, I'd always arrived after the failure. After the bridge showed cracks. After the tunnel showed stress fractures. After the parking structure started dropping concrete. This time I was documenting the warnings before anyone got hurt. A good structural report doesn't fight the building. It documents what's already there, measures the cracks, records the load distribution, and lets the evidence speak when the engineers arrive to make the call. I wasn't deploying this out of revenge. I was doing it because when you suspect a structure won't hold you, document everything measurable before the collapse. Loads, stresses, warnings given, decisions made. I left the recorder in the jacket pocket and hung the jacket back on the chair. 1 week later, I drove to Vernon's house in Winnetka. Not for confrontation, not for argument. Just to return the unsigned liability documents, leave the folder on the hallway table where he'd find it, exit quietly, be done with the whole performance. The front door was unlocked. I'd called ahead, left a message saying I'd drop the papers by. Nobody answered when I called hello from the entryway. I heard Roxanne's voice from down the hall. Half-closed office door. Assumed she was on the phone and I'd leave the folder on the console table without disturbing her. I walked quietly across the marble floor. Her voice carried through the gap in the doorway. Not loud, but clear. Tati, have the medical records. Insomnia, blood pressure, medication, age-related cognition concerns. We can establish diminished capacity. I stopped walking. What if he won't sign? We claim he gave verbal approval while impaired. Roxanne continued. Transfer the liability that way instead. Silence. She was listening to whoever was on the other end. Attorney, probably. The one who'd drafted the trap documents. We'll need video documentation showing confusion, she said. Ask him about dates, mix up names, film his responses. Build the narrative that he wasn't competent to understand what he was approving. Once we establish cognitive decline, his unsigned refusal becomes evidence of impairment, not intent. Another pause. Medical records show treatment for both conditions. That's documented proof of health issues affecting judgment. Add video evidence of confusion, we can argue he's not a credible witness to his own design work. Can't testify against Vernon if we've established he's mentally unfit. My hand tightened on the folder. Plan B. If they couldn't make me sign the confession, they'd make me incompetent to deny it. Not just transfer the liability, eliminate me as a credible witness entirely. Use routine health records against me. Insomnia I'd reported honestly to my doctor. Blood pressure medication half the men my age took. Construct a cognitive decline narrative from normal aging film-engineered moments, designed to make me look confused, then present it all as evidence I'd approved Vernon's structural compromises while mentally impaired. They'd get liability transfer either way. Either I signed admitting I'd approved the modifications, or they'd claim I'd approved them verbally while too cognitively compromised to remember doing it. And if I tried to testify against Vernon, later tried to expose the theft, the safety cuts, the deliberate endangerment, they'd present medical records and confusion videos, proving I was an unreliable witness suffering from age-related mental decline. Complete legal destruction, disguised as compassionate concern for an elderly man who couldn't remember what he'd said or done. Roxanne was still talking. Something about deposition strategy, expert medical witnesses, precedent cases establishing incompetence. I set the folder down on the console table, didn't make a sound, turned around, walked back across the marble floor. My footsteps silent as structural assessment. Opened the front door carefully, stepped outside, closed it with the soft click of a latch finding home. Walked to my truck parked at the curb. My hand didn't shake when I opened the door. My pulse didn't spike when I turned the key. I've walked out of more dangerous buildings than that. Buildings that were actively failing. Concrete cracking under my feet. Load-bearing walls making sounds they shouldn't make. I left the file on the hallway table where Vernon would find it unsigned just like the first time. My hand didn't shake when I turned the doorknob. My pulse didn't spike when I started the truck. I've walked out of more dangerous buildings than that one. Buildings that were actively failing, concrete cracking under my feet. This was just a house where two people were on the phone planning to destroy me. Structurally, it was perfectly sound. If you're still with me, you already know this isn't over. Before we go further, tell me in the comments, would you have walked away right then or kept gathering evidence like I did? And if you haven't already, hit subscribe so you don't miss how this ends. Roxanne arrived at 2:47 on a Thursday afternoon without calling first, which should have been my first warning. In 3 years of marriage to my son, she'd never once stopped by unannounced. I'd spent the previous 3 days thinking about what I'd overheard. The Plan B conversation. The cognitive decline narrative. The video evidence they needed to build their case. Now here she was, and I knew exactly why. Opal answered the door, voice bright with surprise. Roxanne, I didn't know you were coming by. Just in the neighborhood. Thought I'd say hello. They came into the living room where I was reading the newspaper. Opal offered coffee. Roxanne settled onto the sofa, setting her phone face down on the coffee table. I saw it immediately. Tiny LED indicator, light on the phone's edge, glowing red against black glass. Camera active. Recording. 40 years of spotting hairline cracks in concrete meant I noticed things other people missed. Microscopic fractures. Stress indicators smaller than a pinhead. Warning signs invisible to untrained eyes. The camera light was smaller than most structural flaws I documented. I saw it before she asked her first question. How are you feeling, Mr. Prescott? Roxanne asked, voice warm and concerned. Vernon mentioned you've seemed a little tired lately. I feel fine, I said. That's good. How did that meeting go last Tuesday? The one with the city planning office about the property lines. I folded my newspaper carefully. I wasn't at any meeting last Tuesday, I said. I was home all day, and I've never had business with city planning. She blinked, smiled, adjusted. Oh, I must have gotten the day wrong. Was it Wednesday? I haven't attended any meetings with any city offices about any property lines, I said slowly, clearly. This is the first time you've mentioned anything about property lines. Opal returned with coffee, set cups on coasters, sat in the chair across from me. Roxanne tried again. Did you ever find those old survey documents I asked you to look for? The ones from when you first bought the house. I looked at her directly. You've never asked me to look for any documents, I said. This is the first time you've mentioned surveys. Really? She frowned as if confused. I could have sworn we talked about that. Maybe I mentioned it to your wife instead. Opal looked uncertain. I don't remember any conversation about surveys. Roxanne laughed lightly. I must be mixing things up. Too many projects at once. Speaking of which, did you ever meet with that engineer Vernon introduced you to, the one consulting on the River North project? Vernon has never introduced me to any engineers, I said. I've had no involvement with the River North project. Each answer precise, each correction calm, each false premise documented in real time by her own recording device. She kept trying. Wrong dates, non-existent meetings, people I'd never met, events that never happened. I answered every question with the same methodical clarity I'd used in 40 years of expert witness testimony. No defensiveness, no anger. Just facts stated slowly enough that any recording would capture perfect mental clarity. I wasn't there. That didn't happen. I've never met that person. You're mistaken about the date. I watched her frustration build, the smile tightening, the questions coming faster, more obviously engineered. She left at 4:15, claiming Aaron's phone retrieved from the table with barely concealed irritation. I waited until I heard her car pull out of the driveway. Then I went to my study and wrote down every question she'd asked, with exact timestamps. Old habit from 4 decades of documentation. Except this time I was documenting an attempted demolition instead of preventing one. The next day, I returned from the hardware store around 3:30. Entered through the kitchen door, quietly, hadn't meant to be silent, just happened to close it softly out of habit. Heard the scanner humming before I saw it. Opal sat at the small desk near the window document scanner on the surface, papers spread before her. My papers. Medical records from my last checkup. Insomnia medication notes. Blood pressure readings. Geriatric wellness visit summary. She was scanning them methodically, 1 page at a time, feeding each sheet through the machine, watching it process, setting it aside, reaching for the next. She didn't hear me enter. I stood in the doorway and watched my wife of 41 years transfer my private medical information to digital files. Watched her read each page before scanning. Watched her handle documentation of my health the way someone handles evidence they're collecting. She finally noticed my reflection in the window glass, froze mid-scan page halfway through the machine, turned slowly. The excuse came too fast. Vernon needed updated medical information for the family insurance policy. They require everyone's records. I was going to tell you. I looked at the pages spread across her desk. You read the insomnia notes, I said. Not a question. The blood pressure medication, the geriatric wellness visit summary, and you're scanning them for our son. Silence. We'd been married 41 years, raised 2 sons together, buried both our fathers, survived 3 cross-country moves, and 1 near bankruptcy. And here we were standing 6 feet apart in our own kitchen, with my medical records on the scanner between us, like evidence at a crime scene. She didn't deny it, didn't apologize, just looked at me with something between defiance and shame. He's our son, she said finally. I'm helping our son by giving him ammunition to claim I'm mentally incompetent. That's not what this is. Then what is it? She didn't answer. I walked past her without another word, went to my study, opened my engineering journal to a clean page, wrote carefully the way I documented 40 years of structural investigations. January 23rd, 2024, 15:47 hours. OP observed scanning personal medical documentation without authorization. Records transferred to VP for undisclosed purpose. Marital trust failure documented. Closed the journal. I sat in the yellow lamplight of my study, the same study where she'd stood in the hallway months ago, while our son made copies of blueprints that should have been safe in my filing cabinet. 41 years. And in the end, she had handed them the same thing she would have handed a stranger, everything they needed to destroy me, wrapped in the excuse that she was helping family. There's a specific entry in every structural failure report I've ever written, usually near the end, labeled Recommendation for Remedial Action, the part where you decide whether to reinforce what's failing or evacuate before it collapses entirely. That night, after watching my wife scan my medical records for our son's conspiracy, I sat at my study desk and opened my engineering journal to a clean page. Started writing. January 23rd, 2024, 19:34 hours. Wife scanned personal medical records without authorization. Transferred to VP for undisclosed purpose. 6th, documented betrayal. Pattern consistent family conspiracy to transfer structural liability via legal/medical incapacitation narrative. I turned back several pages and began logging every documented betrayal chronologically, the way I document a structural inspection report. Summer 2023, blueprint theft. Wife facilitated access, provided unsupervised opportunity, maintained plausible deniability. December 5th, 2023. Anonymous safety report forwarded to VP within 48 hours via Building Department insider Glenn Whitlock. Confidential whistleblower protection compromised. Yanchita. January 2024, liability transfer documents presented under false pretense. Page 4 contained retroactive consultant designation, transferring criminal/civil responsibility. January 2024. Plan B overheard. Medical records weaponization strategy, cognitive decline, narrative video evidence fabrication plan. January 2024. Video entrapment attempted. Camera recording engineered confusion questions. Attempt failed due to precise responses. January 23, 2024. Medical records scanned without consent. Each entry clinical, dated, cross-referenced. I could walk downstairs right now. Confront all of them. Walk into the living room where Opal was watching television, demand answers, force acknowledgement of the conspiracy. But confrontation gives warning, lets them adjust their plans. Destroy evidence. Create new traps I haven't anticipated yet. Better to document silently. Build a complete evidentiary timeline. Let them believe I remain unaware while I methodically construct the case that will expose the entire conspiracy when the timing is right. Engineering principle applied to family warfare. Measure everything before you make the structural intervention. In structural engineering, there's a critical difference between emergency shoring, quick fixes to prevent immediate collapse, and comprehensive remediation addressing the root failure so the building stands for decades. I was done with emergency shoring. I wrote one more entry, February 1st, 2024. Strategic decision documentation continues. Confrontation deferred. Optimal intervention timing yet to be determined. Engineering assessment family structure compromised beyond repair. Recommendation for remedial action, complete exposure at maximum impact moment. Closed the journal, sat in the yellow lamplight of my study and felt the power shift. They thought they were hunting me, setting traps, maneuvering me into corners. They didn't know I'd been documenting every move with 40 years of investigative discipline. 2 weeks later, mid-February morning, Opal walked down the front path to retrieve the mail. I found out about this part later. Much later. But I can see it clearly now, the way you can see a structural failure once you understand where the first crack started. She sorted through the usual stack: bills, advertisements, credit card offers. One heavy cream envelope stood out from the rest. Embossed seal in the corner. Illinois Structural Engineering Association. Addressed to Rufus Prescott. She opened it routinely. She'd always handled household mail, sorted what needed my attention from what didn't, unfolded the formal invitation printed on expensive cardstock. Lifetime Achievement Award. She read aloud to herself in the empty hallway. You are invited as special guest of honor to the annual Midwest Structural Safety Gala, April 12th, 2024, McCormick Place Convention Center. Kept reading. In recognition of 4 decades of distinguished service to structural safety engineering and prevention of catastrophic failures. Her eyes moved down the page to the final paragraph. Please keep this invitation confidential until the evening of the ceremony. We want this recognition to be a meaningful surprise for all attendees. She stood there holding it. Moment of decision crystallizing. Vernon had been talking about the promotion announcement coming soon. Positioning himself for industry recognition at the spring conferences. Building his reputation as an innovator. His father receiving a major award at a convention center ceremony would overshadow everything. Worse, the ceremony would be filled with structural engineers. People who might recognize my work. Who might ask questions about the River North project. Who might notice similarities between the award recipient's research and Vernon's recent innovations. Who might expose the theft. She folded the invitation carefully along its creases, walked to the bedroom, opened her nightstand drawer. The copy of my medical records she'd scanned 2 weeks earlier rested at the bottom. Insomnia notes. Blood pressure medication. Geriatric wellness visit summary. She placed the envelope on top of the medical records, closed the drawer, stood there in the bedroom we'd shared for 41 years, holding the invitation that represented everything I'd worked for. She'd read the words, "Please keep this confidential," read them explicitly, understood exactly what was being asked, and she chose to hide it anyway. One more secret buried in the drawer next to my stolen medical records. Despite the confidentiality request stated plainly on expensive cardstock. Despite 41 years of marriage. Despite knowing this represented a lifetime achievement recognition that comes once in a career if it comes at all. She chose our son's fraudulent career over my earned recognition. And Vernon's worked so hard for this promotion, she said to the empty bedroom voice, barely a whisper. This is his moment. Rufus would overshadow everything. He never knew when to stay in the background. This is better for the family. Closed the drawer, walked back downstairs, never mentioned the invitation. Not that night, not the next day. Not in the weeks that followed as April approached, and the ceremony date drew closer. I found out later, much later, that she had read every word of that invitation. Every word. Including the part that said, "Please keep this invitation confidential until the evening of the ceremony." She read it, understood exactly what it meant, knew this was the kind of recognition that comes once in a lifetime. And she still put it in the drawer, hidden beside the medical records she'd already given our son. Because protecting Vernon's lie mattered more than celebrating 40 years of my truth. Lyle called from my wife's bedroom on a Tuesday morning, 5 days before the ceremony I didn't yet know existed, saying the nightstand drawer was jammed and asking if I had a wood plane in the garage. I found him in the master bedroom, with the entire drawer removed, sitting on the floor, examining the misaligned track that had caused it to stick. "Track's warped," he said. "Should be able to sand it down." Then, he reached into the drawer he'd set on the bed and pulled out a cream-colored envelope. "This was inside," he said quietly. "Next to a copy of your medical records, both hidden together." He handed it to me without opening it. The envelope was heavy, expensive paper, embossed seal in the corner, Illinois Structural Engineering Association. Addressed to me, I opened it carefully. Formal invitation on thick cardstock, gold lettering. Lifetime Achievement Award. You are invited as special guest of honor to the annual Midwest Structural Safety Gala, April 12, 2024, McCormick Place Convention Center. In recognition of 4 decades of distinguished service to structural safety engineering and prevention of catastrophic failures. April 12th, 5 days from now. I turned the envelope over in my hands, examining the edges. There. Tiny slit along the top seam. Faint glue residue where someone had carefully resealed it. Now she opened it, I said, showing Lyle the evidence. "See the glue residue here." She read the whole thing, then sealed it shut and put it back in the drawer. Lyle looked at the envelope, then at me. "Next to your medical records," he said again. Both hidden in the same place. The invitation included a final paragraph. "You please keep this invitation confidential until the evening of the ceremony. We want this recognition to be a meaningful surprise for all attendees." She'd read that too. Read it explicitly. Understood what was being asked, and still hid it. "Did your mother know you found this?" I asked. "No, I came straight to you." "Well, good. Let's keep it that way." I folded the invitation carefully and placed it in my jacket breast pocket. The same pocket that already held the audio recorder I'd carried through 40 years of structural investigations. Recognition and evidence stored together. My wife had read every word of that invitation 2 months ago and hidden it in a drawer beside my stolen medical records. My son was about to receive credit for work he'd destroyed. And now I had 5 days to decide what kind of man I wanted to be when the truth finally came out. Lyle fixed the drawer. We didn't talk about what he'd found. He left around noon. I sat in my study and looked at the invitation for a long time. 4 days later, Thursday, April 8th, Roxanne attended a construction industry networking lunch downtown. I didn't know about this until later, but the timeline matters, and I've pieced together what happened from enough sources to see it clearly. She was working the room the way she always did, making connections, building relationships, positioning Vernon for the next opportunity. She overheard a colleague mention something about Saturday. Big recognition event at McCormick Place, the man said to someone else. Someone's family member being honored. Should be quite the ceremony. Roxanne's attention sharpened immediately. Saturday, McCormick Place, recognition ceremony. Vernon had been talking about the vice president promotion for months, saying the announcement was coming soon. Positioning himself as the innovative leader who'd brought cutting-edge seismic technology to Chicago's residential market. This had to be it. She spent Thursday afternoon making phone calls. 7 of them. I know because Vernon mentioned it later, and because some of those calls became very public very quickly. First 3 went to construction industry contacts and trade publication reporters. I can't share details yet, she said on each call, but watch for major news Saturday evening, McCormick Place. Vernon's big moment has finally arrived. Next 2 went to friends in their social circle. Yeah, watch for Vernon's news this weekend. We've been waiting for this for years. 6th call went to Gibson's Steakhouse. I need a private dining room for 12 Saturday, April 12th, around 9 p.m. We're celebrating a major career milestone. Spare no expense. The 7th call went to Vernon at his office. I've arranged everything, she told him. Everyone who matters will be watching Saturday. I've alerted the industry reporters, booked the celebration dinner, made sure all the right people know to pay attention. This is your night. Vernon hesitated. Are you absolutely sure this event is about my promotion? He asked. The timing seems... She cut him off. Who else would they be honoring from our family? Your father. He's been retired for years. He barely leaves the house anymore. This is your night, Vernon. I'm making sure it gets the recognition it deserves. She made 7 phone calls that afternoon. Each one another nail in the coffin she didn't know she was building, not for me but for the lie she'd spent months helping my son construct. Publicly advertising the ceremony to industry reporters, inviting maximum professional witnesses, booking an expensive celebration dinner for the evening. My son's fraud would be exposed to 300 structural engineers, building social expectations for a promotion announcement that would never come, creating public anticipation that would transform into collective humiliation. Her confidence engineering the perfect trap. I found out about the phone calls Friday morning when Vernon called me voice tight with anxiety, asking if I knew anything about a ceremony at McCormick Place on Saturday. Roxanne seems certain it's about my promotion, he said. But I haven't received any official notification. Have you heard anything? I looked at the invitation in my jacket pocket. No, I said, I haven't heard anything. Roxanne made 7 phone calls on Thursday, building anticipation for Saturday's big announcement, booking celebration dinners, alerting industry contacts to watch for Vernon's moment of triumph. She was smiling the way people smile when they think they've already won, when they've planned every detail, invited all the right witnesses, prepared for victory. She just didn't know yet whose victory they'd all be witnessing. I checked the audio recorder one more time in my truck before walking up to Vernon's front door. Friday evening, battery, full memory, clear red indicator light, confirming it was already running in my breast pocket before I even rang the doorbell. 14 hours until the ceremony. They had no idea I'd been invited. No idea the event Roxanne had spent all week advertising was about to expose everything they'd built on lies. Vernon answered the door. Dad, thanks for coming over. Roxanne was waiting in the living room. Opal sat on the sofa, hands folded in her lap, saying nothing. The liability documents were spread across the coffee table. Same ones I'd refused to sign in January. Clean copies, freshly printed. And we just need to finalize this paperwork, Vernon said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Legal protection for the family. Standard procedure. I sat down. The recorder in my pocket pressed against my chest. Roxanne leaned forward, voice gentle and reasonable. Mr. Prescott, this just clarifies your consulting role on the project. If anyone ever questions the structural decisions this document shows, we all agreed on the approach. It actually protects you. I picked up the first page. What consulting role? I asked. I was never consulted on River North. You provided the foundational research, Vernon said quickly. The original load distribution work. This acknowledges your contribution. For 40 years, I'd asked questions in failure investigations, not to challenge the engineers, but to get them talking, to let them explain their reasoning, until the pattern of the failure revealed itself in their own words. This was no different, except this time the failure was my family. What specific date is on this version? I asked, turning to page 4. Vernon glanced at Roxanne. It's backdated to the design phase, she said. Standard practice for establishing consulting timelines. Shows your involvement from the beginning. Which law firm prepared these documents? C.D. Morrison and Blake, Vernon said. Corporate counsel. They handle all our contract work. I read section 4.7 slowly. Why does this section reference my advisory role when I was never consulted on any structural modifications? Roxanne shifted in her seat. That's just legal language, Mr. Prescott. It establishes that you were part of the technical review team. Spreads responsibility across multiple advisors instead of concentrating it on one person. What exactly does transferring liability mean in this context? Silence. Vernon cleared his throat. It means if there's ever an investigation into the building, which there won't be, this shows you were consulted on the design approach. So any questions about structural adequacy would be directed to the consulting team, not just to me personally. And who's on this consulting team? You and me, Vernon said. The document establishes us as co-advisors on the structural specifications. I set the document down. So if the building fails, I said slowly, this document makes me legally responsible for approving the structural decisions. Roxanne spoke quickly. It shares responsibility, Mr. Prescott. That's actually better for everyone. No single person carries all the liability. But I didn't make any structural decisions on River North. You provided the research foundation, Vernon repeated. The original design work. This just formalizes that contribution. I looked at my wife. She sat perfectly still, hands folded, eyes on the carpet, not defending me, not questioning them. Just sitting there while our son explained how a document would transfer criminal liability from him to me. What happens if I don't sign? I asked. Vernon and Roxanne exchanged a glance. Then the insurance company requires additional verification, Roxanne said. More paperwork, delays. It's really easier for everyone if we finalize this tonight. I looked at the clock on the mantel. 9:10 p.m. 37 minutes since I'd walked through the door. 37 minutes of recorded conversation explaining exactly how they planned to frame me for my son's fraud. Every word captured on a device that had been admitted as evidence in 36 previous court cases. Let me sleep on it, I said. Vernon's shoulders relaxed visibly. That's all we're asking, Dad. Just think it over. Take all the time you need, Roxanne added, smile returning. We can finalize it tomorrow, after the weekend. I stood up, buttoned my jacket carefully over the pocket containing 40 years of investigative credibility. I'll give you my answer tomorrow, I said. Vernon walked me to the door. Thanks for coming over, Dad. I know this seems like a lot of legal complexity, but it really is just standard procedure. I nodded, got in my truck, drove home, placed the recorder in my study safe beside the engineering journal where every betrayal was documented. And I did sleep on it. I slept very well. For the first time in months, I slept like a man who'd finally finished documenting the cracks before the collapse. I found out later that Vernon called Roxanne from the driveway before I'd even turned off my bedroom light. Lyle overheard the conversation through the wall. They shared a property line thin barrier between houses. He's going to sign, Vernon said. Tomorrow after the ceremony he'll sign. We just need to get through Saturday. Roxanne's voice carried through the phone, confident and clear. He's weakening. Did you see how he asked about the details? He's trying to understand it, not fight it. Tomorrow he'll sign. They had no idea what Saturday would bring. I drove home at 9:47 p.m., placed the recorder in my study safe, beside the engineering journal where every betrayal was logged, and went to bed. They thought I was weakening. Thought the questions meant I was trying to understand their reasoning so I could accept it. They didn't know I'd been asking questions exactly the same way for 40 years, not to understand the failure, but to document it in the speaker's own words before the final report was written. I slept very well that night. They had no idea what Saturday would bring. Roxanne's voice cut through the Saturday evening traffic noise outside McCormick Place, before we'd even reached the entrance. Are you seriously wearing that? Her eyes scanning my 20-year-old navy suit like it was evidence of a crime. Saturday had arrived exactly as I knew it would. We'd driven separately. Vernon and Roxanne in his Mercedes, Opal in her sedan, Lyle in his work truck with 8-year-old Stellan. I'd driven alone in my 15-year-old pickup, the invitation in my jacket pocket, the same pocket where the recorder had lived the night before. The convention center rose ahead of us, glass and steel gleaming under evening lights. 6:30 p.m. 90 minutes until the ceremony began. Roxanne wore a cocktail dress that probably cost more than my truck. Vernon had on a tailored suit, expensive watch catching the light. Opal looked elegant in black jewelry I'd bought her for our 40th anniversary, sparkling at her throat. Lyle wore work clothes. Stellan had on his church shirt, sleeves a little too short. I wore the same navy suit I'd worn to professional conferences for 20 years. Clean, pressed, perfectly serviceable. People will think we brought the driver, Roxanne said loud enough that a couple walking past turned to look. Vernon took my elbow, guiding me a few steps away from the group. Dad, there are important people inside, he said quietly. Don't approach anyone on your own. Stay behind us. Smile when you need to. And please don't start telling your old stories about bridge inspections or whatever. Nobody wants to hear about work from 30 years ago. I looked at my son, 42 years old, wearing a suit worth more than I'd spent on clothing in the past decade. About to walk into a ceremony where he expected to be recognized for innovations he'd stolen from his father. I understand, I said. Roxanne moved closer, voice dropping to something colder than the April evening air. Don't embarrass us, she said. One mistake tonight could affect my husband's promotion. Do you understand what's at stake here? I nodded. She studied my face, apparently not satisfied. Actually, would it be easier if you just waited outside? We can come get you after the main part. There's going to be a lot of standing around networking technical discussions you won't follow. You'd probably be more comfortable in the truck. She was suggesting I wait in the parking lot, while inside 300 structural engineers gathered to honor me for 40 years of work. She thought I'd be too confused to follow. Vernon didn't counter his wife's suggestion, just added his own refinement. Now this is a world where presentation matters, Dad. Just stand back and don't say anything. That's all we're asking. Opal spoke for the first time since we'd parked. Shalk, you know your place here, she said, adjusting her purse strap. This is our son's world, not yours. My wife had read the invitation 2 months ago and hidden it in a drawer. My son had stolen my work and called it innovation. And now, standing outside the building where I was about to be honored for 40 years of integrity, my daughter-in-law was suggesting I wait in the parking lot like luggage they'd rather not carry. Lyle stepped forward, face flushed with anger. If you're all ashamed of him, he said, voice tight, I'll take him home right now. Stellan grabbed my hand. His small fingers wrapped around mine, grip surprisingly strong for an 8-year-old. I'm not ashamed of you, Grandpa, he said. I looked down at my grandson. Same eyes as mine. Same way of watching people, noticing things others missed. Then I placed my hand on Lyle's shoulder. It's all right, I said gently. I've been waiting for this evening for a long time. Lyle searched my face, confusion mixing with fury. He didn't understand why I wasn't angry, why I wasn't fighting back, why I was accepting the humiliation so calmly. Vernon and Roxanne exchanged a glance. Relief. They'd interpreted my words as acceptance, as understanding my place, as agreeing to stay quiet and invisible while they enjoyed the spotlight they thought belonged to them. They had no idea what I meant. No idea that I'd been waiting for this evening since the moment Lyle handed me that cream envelope 5 days ago. Since the moment I'd discovered my wife had hidden it deliberately. Since I'd listened to Vernon and Roxanne explain how they planned to frame me for fraud while I recorded every word. This is a world where presentation matters, my son said. He was right. He just didn't know yet whose presentation they were all about to witness. We walked toward the entrance. Vernon and Roxanne in front, moving with the confidence of people who believed they controlled the narrative. Opal beside them, playing the role she'd perfected over 41 years of marriage, supporting her son, diminishing her husband. Lyle walked beside me, Stellan between us, small hand still gripping mine. "Grandpa," Stellan whispered. "Why are they being mean to you?" "Because they don't know any better," I said quietly. "Are you really going to wait outside?" "No, I'm going inside. I have an invitation." The boy looked up at me, trying to understand. "Will you tell me about it later?" he asked. "I'll tell you everything," I promised. "But first, you're going to see something I want you to remember." "What?" "See how truth works when you've been patient enough to document it properly." He didn't understand. 8 years old, he couldn't. But someday he would. Vernon looked back at me one more time before reaching the entrance doors. The look you give someone when you're not sure they understand the stakes. Not sure they'll behave the way you need them to. Not sure they'll stay in their place. I understood perfectly. In 90 minutes, this same son would watch me walk onto a stage in front of 300 structural engineers while he sat in the audience with his wife and mother. He would finally understand that presentation does matter. That for 40 years, I'd been presenting integrity while he'd been presenting theft. That the world he thought was his had never stopped being mine. I'd just been patient enough to let him think otherwise while I documented every crack in the foundation he'd built on lies. We walked through the doors into McCormick Place, into the lobby where check-in desks waited, where Vernon would scan his corporate guest invitation with confidence, where I would pull out an envelope he'd never seen, and where everything he thought he knew about this evening would begin to collapse. Vernon's invitation scanned with a clean beep at exactly 7:04 p.m. "Welcome, Sir Corporate Guests to the right." And he turned to me with the small, satisfied smile of someone who'd just confirmed he belonged in a room where I didn't. The collapse had already begun. He just didn't know it yet. We stood in the McCormick Place lobby. Registration desks stretched along the wall, professional staff, checking credentials, directing guests to appropriate seating sections. Vernon approached the desk confidently. Pulled out his phone, displayed the QR code from his corporate guest invitation. The scanner beeped green. "Corporate guests are seated to the right rows, 7 through 12, the staff member said. "Enjoy the ceremony." Vernon nodded, glanced back at me with that smile. "Come on, Dad," he said. "Let's find our seats." I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out the cream envelope with the Illinois Structural Engineering Association seal, the one my wife had hidden in her nightstand drawer for 2 months, handed it to the staff member. She scanned the code printed on the invitation. The scanner didn't beep green. It flashed gold. Her expression changed instantly, professional smile shifting to something more alert. She looked at the screen, then at me, then pressed a button calling someone over. Margaret Thornhill appeared within 30 seconds. Event services manager at McCormick Place for 15 years, the kind of professional who recognized VIP designation codes instantly. Gold-level honors meant someone the organizing committee wanted treated with exceptional care. She examined the screen, then looked at me directly. "Our honored guest has arrived," she said warmly. "We've been expecting you, Mr. Prescott. If you'll come with me, we have reserved seating in the front section." Vernon stepped forward. "Nah, there must be some mistake," he said. "He's with me. We're family." Margaret smiled politely but firmly. "No mistake, sir. Mr. Prescott is the guest we were asked to escort personally. Your seating is in Section B." She gestured to a protocol staff member who appeared beside her. "Please escort Mr. Prescott and his guests to VIP Row 2, she said. Lyle stepped beside me. Stellan grabbed my hand. I didn't look back at Vernon. Didn't acknowledge Roxanne's confusion or Opal's frozen expression. Just followed the staff member toward the main hall, while Margaret directed my son and his family toward the general admissions section. I heard Roxanne's voice behind me growing distant. There's definitely been a mistake. I kept walking toward the front row they'd reserved for me. The same front row my family had just told me I didn't belong in. The main hall was massive. Professional stage at the front. Large screens flanking both sides. 300 seats arranged in rising rows. Row 2 center section. Reserved seating with small placards. The staff member gestured to 3 seats. "For you and your guests, Mr. Prescott." Lyle sat on my left. Stellan on my right, small legs swinging above the floor, not quite reaching the ground. Behind us, 6 rows back, I could feel rather than see my other family finding their assigned seats in Section B. Row 8, General Admission, where corporate guests sat. 7:30 p.m. The ceremony began. MC walked onto stage. Professional, polished voice carrying clearly through the excellent acoustics. "Welcome to the annual Midwest Structural Safety Gala. Tonight we celebrate innovation, integrity, and 40 years of excellence in engineering that saves lives." Applause. Before we present our featured recognition, let's acknowledge this year's completed projects. The screen lit up with project names, building photographs, completion dates. River North Residential Complex appeared 5th on the list. Name, completion date, brief description. No award, no special recognition. Just listed among a dozen other projects that had been completed on schedule. I didn't turn around, but I imagined Vernon sitting very straight in row 8, waiting for more, expecting elaboration, anticipating the moment when they'd call him forward. Roxanne would be checking her phone, preparing to record. The list continued. More projects, more names, more photographs. River North wasn't mentioned again. The MC moved on. "Before we present tonight's highest honor, our chairman Winston Caldwell would like to say a few words." I heard movement behind me, Vernon rising slightly in his seat. Roxanne's whisper carrying forward, "This is it." Winston Caldwell stepped onto the stage, 71 years old. Gray hair, commanding presence. He'd built the largest construction conglomerate in the Midwest over 4 decades, but he'd never forgotten the day a younger engineer named Rufus Prescott stopped him from signing off on a bridge support design that would have killed his career and a dozen workers. He didn't stay on the stage, walked down the steps, into the audience. I heard Vernon rise further behind me, heard Roxanne lift her phone. Winston walked past 300 people. Walked past my son, who was half standing with his mouth open. Walked past my wife, who'd hidden the invitation 2 months ago. And he stopped in front of me, extended his hand. "Sir," he said, voice clear enough for the hall to hear. "I'm glad you finally came. We've been looking forward to this evening." I stood, shook his hand. The hall had gone completely quiet. Behind me, I heard Vernon sit back down hard. Winston turned to address the audience, one hand still resting on my shoulder. 43 years ago, he said, I was a young engineer about to sign off on a bridge support design that would have collapsed within 5 years. This man, my teacher, stopped me. He paused, let that sink in. He said something I've never forgotten. He said a building isn't measured by how tall it stands. It's measured by how many people can walk in and come home safe. Recognition was building in the room. 300 structural engineers understanding that they were about to witness something rare. Winston continued telling the story of how a mentor had shaped not just his career, but his entire approach to engineering. How safety standards mattered more than deadlines. How integrity built structures that lasted. I stood there, hand in Winston's grip, aware of my grandson watching with wide eyes. Aware of Lyle sitting perfectly still beside me. Aware of 300 engineers listening to my former student describe principles I'd spent 40 years defending. Aware that somewhere in row 8, my son was frozen. My wife was silent. My daughter-in-law's phone was still recording the wrong person entirely. 300 people were watching. My son was somewhere in row 8, still half risen from his seat phone in his wife's hand, recording the wrong person entirely. Winston Caldwell was introducing me to a room full of structural engineers as the teacher who'd shaped his career. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, longer than I'd been dismissed at dinner tables, erased in office introductions, told to wait outside in trucks, I didn't feel invisible. The lights dimmed again. The screen behind Winston Caldwell flickered to life, not with slides or charts, but with a black and white photograph from 1987. I recognized the bridge before I recognized myself. For years I'd been invisible, at dinner tables, in office introductions, outside convention centers where I'd been told to wait in trucks. Now 300 structural engineers were looking at evidence I'd existed all along. The image showed a massive bridge under construction, steel beams, concrete supports, safety rigging everywhere, and standing in the foreground, wearing a hard hat and holding blueprints, a young engineer. 31 years old. Me. Winston's voice filled the hall. 1987. The Harrison Street Bridge Reinforcement Project. This engineer, he gestured toward me in the second row, identified a critical flaw in the original contractor's beam placement. 12 hours before they poured concrete that would have locked in the error permanently. His intervention saved the project and likely saved lives. Murmurs rippled through the audience. The screen changed. Another black and white photograph. 1991. A tunnel entrance, emergency vehicles surrounding it. Workers being let out. Me standing with hard hat and clipboard coordinating the evacuation. The Riverside Tunnel Project. Winston continued. This engineer noticed stress fractures in the support structure during a routine inspection. Ordered immediate evacuation. 2 hours later, the north section collapsed. 0 casualties. Because someone was paying attention. The audience wasn't murmuring anymore. They were completely silent, listening. Stellan beside me whispered something. I didn't hear it at first. Then louder, "That's you, Grandpa. That's really you." I looked down at my grandson. 8 years old, small hand, gripping the armrest, staring at the screen with wide eyes. The screen changed again. 1998. A high-rise building scaffolding covering one side. Me in the frame again, older now, pointing at something on a structural diagram, while 3 other engineers listened. The Parkview Tower retrofit, Winston said. Original construction had used substandard materials that were degrading faster than predicted. This engineer's analysis prevented what would have been a catastrophic failure. 320 residential units. Over 800 occupants. All safe because someone refused to stay quiet about what he'd found. I turned slightly, looking at Stellan's face in profile. Same angle as the young man in that first photograph. Same determined expression I must have worn at 31, standing on that bridge, refusing to let them pour concrete over a mistake. The pattern repeating. The next generation carrying forward what mattered. Winston paused, let the images sink in. 3 disasters prevented. Countless lives saved. 40 years of integrity in an industry that sometimes values speed over safety, profit over people. Then his tone shifted. Harder. Colder. Which brings us to tonight's difficult truth. The screen changed again. Split image this time. Two blueprints side by side. I recognized them both instantly. Left side, my original design from 2004. The load distribution system I'd spent 6 months developing. My signature in the bottom right corner. Every safety specification detailed. 8 primary tie rods per support column. Redundant sensor arrays. Emergency stairwell placement designed for optimal evacuation flow. Fire suppression system integrated throughout. Right side, the same architectural layout. Same triaxial load-sharing nodes. Same innovative stress path modeling. But the safety components were gone. Tie rods reduced from 8 to 4 per column. Sensor arrays deleted from equipment lists. Emergency stairwell relocated to save square footage. Fire suppression system simplified to bare minimum code compliance. And in the signature block, where my name should have been blank space, erased, replaced with a different name, a different date. 20 years later. Vernon Prescott, 2024. Winston let the audience study the comparison. The left blueprint, he said quietly, represents the original 2004 design. Innovative, safe, submitted to Midwestern Engineering Solutions 20 years ago. The engineer was asked to reduce costs by 15%. He refused. The project was suspended. Silence in the hall. Complete, absolute. The right blueprint represents the design as built for the River North residential complex. Completed last year. Same innovative architecture. Same load distribution concepts. But the expensive safety systems have been removed. And the signature has been changed. I heard movement behind me. Couldn't tell if it was Vernon or someone else. Didn't turn to look. The person responsible for this fraud, Winston said, voice carrying to every corner of the hall, is in this room. Vernon's face must have been draining of color. I could feel it happening without seeing it. The way you feel a structure starting to fail before the visible cracks appear. Every eye in the hall turned. Not toward the stage, toward the Prescott name. Toward row 8, where my son sat with his wife and mother. I never wanted this. Never wanted to destroy my son publicly. Never wanted to stand in front of 300 engineers while his theft was exposed on a screen 40 feet wide. But 140 families lived inside that building. Slept in bedrooms held up by half the safety margin the design required. Cooked dinner beneath ceiling joists that should have had twice the reinforcement they carried. I'd spent 40 years preventing structural failures. This was just another failure. It just happened to be my family instead of a building. The split-screen image stayed on display. Original design on the left, stolen version on the right. My signature visible. My name erased. 20 years of refusal to compromise turned into my son's career achievement by deleting the parts that kept people safe. Winston spoke again, gentler now. We invited the original engineer tonight to honor 40 years of integrity, to recognize a career spent putting safety above profit, to acknowledge that some principles matter more than convenient shortcuts. He turned, looked directly at me. Sir, would you stand? I stood. 300 engineers applauded. Behind me, somewhere in row 8, my son sat silent. My wife sat frozen. My daughter-in-law's phone had stopped recording. Never imagined I'd need my own blueprint on a screen to prove what my son had done. But the proof was there. 2 designs, 1 thief, and 300 witnesses. Vernon stood to speak, but Lyle was already walking toward the chairman's table with a tablet in his hand. The applause for my recognition had just faded. 300 engineers still processing what they'd seen on that screen. 2 blueprints, 1 theft, complete exposure. Vernon's mouth opened, started to form words. Probably an explanation, a defense. Something about misunderstandings or context or technical details the audience wouldn't understand. But Lyle reached Winston Caldwell first, handed him the tablet without a word. Winston looked at it, looked at Lyle, then nodded once, tapped something on the screen, connected it to the hall's sound system. Vernon sat back down, face confused. Then Roxanne's voice filled the hall. Not live, recorded. Crystal clear through speakers designed for 300 people. Let the old man sign. If something goes wrong, we'll say the design was his. Silence. Complete. Immediate. Vernon's voice next unmistakable. As long as Dad signs, the company can't touch me. All the liability transfers to him as consulting engineer of record. Opal's voice quieter but still audible. Now don't let him read it carefully. Just get the signature. I sat perfectly still. Heard my wife's voice plan my destruction in front of 300 engineers who'd spent careers building things that lasted. The recording continued. 30 seconds. A minute. 2 minutes. Every word from that Friday night in Vernon's living room. Every question I'd asked. Every answer they'd given believing transparency would convince me to sign. The whole conspiracy laid out in their own voices. When it ended, the hall stayed silent. Roxanne stood face flushed. This is a violation of privacy. Winston's voice cut her off. Cold. Flat. There's nothing to misunderstand about conspiring to transfer criminal liability to a family member, Mrs. Prescott. And this is a private industry gathering, not a courtroom. Though I suspect you'll become familiar with courtrooms shortly. A hand rose from the middle rows. Young man, early 30s. I didn't recognize him. Winston nodded acknowledgement. The man stood. Everett Ashford. He introduced himself to the room. I was site supervisor on the River North project until 3 months ago. He turned toward Vernon. I objected to your cost-cutting modifications in writing, specifically the removal of tie rods and sensor arrays. You terminated me the following week, said I was a poor cultural fit for the company. His voice stayed calm, professional. I retained the emails, all of them, including the ones where you explicitly ordered removal of safety components to reduce material costs by 11%. Vernon started to rise. Then Clayton Burgess's phone started ringing. The building department's senior inspector for high-rise residential structures had been seated at the committee table all evening, reviewing Vernon's credentials for some professional evaluation I wasn't privy to. His phone rang once, twice, 3 times. He stepped out of the hall to answer it. Came back 2 minutes later, face pale, walked directly to Winston, whispered something. Winston's expression changed. He held up a hand for silence, though the room was already quiet. I've just been informed, he said carefully, that seismic sensors at the River North residential complex have detected structural vibration exceeding safety thresholds. A minor tremor 40 minutes ago triggered automated monitoring alerts. My chest tightened. The building department has issued an emergency evacuation order. 140 families are currently inside the structure. 300 engineers understood immediately what that meant. The murmurs started, growing. Winston looked directly at me. Sir, you know that building better than anyone. You designed the original safety systems. You understand the load paths, the stress points, the failure modes. I stood. Where? River North Franklin Street. I was already moving toward the aisle. Vernon's voice behind me. Desperate. Dad. I stopped. Didn't turn around. Just stopped walking. Dad, please. I didn't know, I didn't think. I'll make sure the people inside get out safe, I said. Didn't say anything about him. Didn't offer help with the consequences he'd built for himself. Didn't promise to stand beside him when the investigation started. Just committed to saving the families sleeping in bedrooms held up by calculations my son had cut in half. Lyle was already at the exit, Stellan beside him. Winston called after me. I'm sending emergency services coordination, whatever you need. I nodded without stopping. 20 years ago, I would have turned back for Vernon. would have tried to save him from himself, would have put family loyalty above strangers' safety. Tonight, strangers mattered more than blood, because 140 families deserved to walk into their homes and come back out safe. That's what I'd told Winston 43 years ago. That's what I'd spent my career protecting. And my son had broken that principle to save 11% on materials. The car was waiting outside. Lyle had called ahead while the audio played. He drove. Stellan sat in back, pulling up sensor data on his phone, reading numbers I'd taught him to understand over years of patient explanation. Vibration amplitude exceeding design tolerance by 40%, he reported. Load path redistribution showing stress concentration in columns B7 through B12, the columns where Vernon had reduced tie rods from 8 to 4, exactly where the design would fail first. 140 families sleeping in apartments, held up by materials Vernon had cheapened to save 11%. Structural margins I'd calculated to withstand extraordinary stress cut in half because my son valued profit over people. Some structures can't be repaired from outside. You have to go in, document the damage, evacuate everyone, and hope you're fast enough that when the failure happens, it happens to an empty building instead of an occupied home. We drove toward River North, behind us at McCormick Place. Vernon sat in row 8 with 300 witnesses who'd just heard him confess to fraud, conspiracy, and criminal negligence. Ahead of us, 140 families who had no idea their building was failing. I'd spent 40 years preventing structural collapses. Tonight, I'd prevented my son's career. Tomorrow, I'd prevent his building from killing the people inside. Some structures can't be repaired from outside. The basement smelled like concrete dust and fear. We'd arrived at River North 20 minutes after leaving McCormick Place. Fire trucks already positioned outside. Building department vehicles blocking the street. Emergency lights painting the 15-story structure in rotating red and blue. But no evacuation yet. They'd been waiting for someone who knew the building. Someone who knew where the failures would happen first. Clayton Burgess met me at the entrance, clipboard in hand, face tight with stress. "Column integrity," he asked immediately. "Basement first," I said. "That's where the load path compromises start." Everett Ashford was already there, the engineer Vernon had fired for objecting. He'd followed us from the ceremony, understanding exactly what the sensor alerts meant. We went down, basement level. Support columns rising through concrete. Load-bearing structure that held 14 floors of residential units. I walked the perimeter with a flashlight, checking each column. Ran my hand along the concrete, feeling for hairline cracks. Looked for the telltale signs of stress redistribution, microfractures that signaled impending failure. Found them in columns B7 through B12, exactly where Vernon had reduced the tie rods. Exactly where my original calculations said the building would fail first if the safety margins were cut. "Shot these 3 columns," I said to Clayton, pointing. "If the west side shifts, we'll have 8 minutes, maybe less." "How do you want to run the evacuation?" "Floor by floor. Start at the top. Youngest children and elderly first. Fire department coordinates movement. Nobody uses elevators. Stairwells only, west stairwell, primary east as backup." Clayton nodded, already calling it in. We came back upstairs. Lyle was coordinating with fire department captains, using his electrician's knowledge of the building's systems to map safe routes. Stellan sat in the truck, watching through the window, 8 years old, and wide awake at 10 p.m. on a Saturday night. The evacuation started at 10:47 p.m. Systematic, organized. Floor 14 first. Knock on every door. Explain calmly. No panic. Just procedure. Building inspection found concerns. Everyone needs to leave tonight. Bring essentials. Move quickly, but don't run. Flashlights cutting through dust. Parents carrying sleeping children down stairwells. Elderly residents moving carefully, one step at a time. Sirens outside. Chaos held together by numbers I'd calculated 20 years ago. The design working exactly as I'd intended it to work, giving people time to escape before the structure failed. Even with half the safety margin removed, the engineering was sound enough to hold long enough for evacuation. I stood in the lobby watching families stream out. Mothers with infants, fathers with toddlers, elderly couples helping each other downstairs. Young professionals in pajamas, confused but compliant. 140 residential units. 140 families who had no idea they'd been living inside a building, held together by calculations my son had compromised to save costs. Midnight came, then 1 a.m., then 2. Everett appeared beside me, tablet showing building status. Last families out, he said quietly. Buildings empty. I looked at the structure. Still standing. Columns holding. Load paths redistributing stress exactly as designed. But the sensor data showed progressive degradation. Without immediate reinforcement, the building would fail within months. Maybe weeks. Zero casualties. Clayton said, joining us. Looked at me with something between respect and sadness. You just saved 140 lives with a design your son tried to bury. I didn't respond. Just stood there watching the building I designed 20 years ago, stolen 10 months ago, and saved tonight. We left at 2:30 a.m. Engineering teams already on site planning emergency shoring. Structural reinforcement schedules being drafted. The building would survive, but it would take months of work to make it safe again. Lyle drove. Stellan was asleep in the back by the time we reached my house. I sat at my kitchen table, too tired to sleep, too wired from adrenaline to rest. The doorbell rang at 10:07 a.m. I'd been awake for 26 hours. Deirdre Roche stood on my front step, FBI special agent, assigned to intellectual property and construction fraud cases in the Northern District of Illinois. She had a DOJ attorney with her and a folder that looked official. Mr. Prescott, she said, showing credentials. May we come in? I made coffee. They sat at my kitchen table, opened the folder. We're opening a federal criminal investigation into your son's conduct, Deirdre said directly. Copyright infringement under Title 17 for stolen blueprints. Wire fraud under Title 18, Section 1343 of the U.S. Code for falsified contractor submissions. We're also coordinating with the Illinois Attorney General's office on criminal endangerment charges at the state level. I sipped coffee, said nothing. He's been ordered not to leave Chicago. We'll be executing search warrants on his home and office this afternoon. What about my daughter-in-law? I asked. Deirdre's expression shifted slightly, something between amusement and disgust. I retained separate counsel 2 hours ago, already blaming him, claiming she had no knowledge of the intellectual property theft. Says he controlled all technical decisions, she only handled business development. The family alliance fracturing. Roxanne abandoning Vernon the moment criminal charges appeared. Will you cooperate with the investigation? The DOJ attorney asked. Yes, I said. We'll need your original blueprints, documentation, any communications about the project. It's all in my study, 40 years of documentation. I can have it ready this afternoon. Deirdre nodded, left her card on the kitchen table. Thank you for last night, she said before leaving. The evacuation, 140 families. I'd spent 40 years building structures meant to outlast me. Never thought I'd spend my final years watching my son's life collapse under the weight of his own theft. They left at 10:43 a.m. I sat at my kitchen table looking at the business card. Agent Roche left her card on the kitchen table. The building was still standing at River North Engineers, already drawing up repair schedules. I'd driven home at 4 a.m. with Lyle and Stellan asleep in the truck. Building standing, families safe, enough for one night. 3 days after the ceremony, Vernon showed up at my door and dropped to his knees. One night had been enough to save 140 families. But the days after those required different decisions. He was alone. No Roxanne. No Opal. Just my son, 42 years old, kneeling on my front step the way you kneel when you've run out of options. He's Dad, he said, voice breaking. Please. I did everything for the family. You have to talk to Chairman Caldwell. He'll listen to you. You can explain. I looked at him for a long moment, studied the face I'd watched grow from infant to child to man. Tried to find the boy I'd taught to read blueprints, the teenager I'd brought to construction sites, the young man who'd once asked me how to tell if a structure was built to last. No, I said finally. You didn't do it for the family. You did it because you needed people to admire you. He blinked, tears on his face. Real ones, probably. Dad, please, isn't there anything you can do? I felt something settle in my chest. Understanding, crystallizing. No, you're not here to apologize, I said quietly. You're here because you think I still have something you can use. His expression shifted, just slightly, just enough. I stepped back, closed the door, gently, no slam, no anger, just the soft click of a latch finding home. 1 week later, Opal called. 12th time that week. I'd stopped answering after the 4th call, but this time I picked up. Stitu, I'm alone in this house, she said immediately. No greeting, no preamble. Everyone's gone. The Morgans won't return my calls. The Hendersons canceled bridge. Susan Bradley crossed the street when she saw me at the market. I sat in my study, phone pressed to my ear. Said nothing. Come home, she said, voice cracking. We can start over. 41 years has to mean something. We can start over. Silence stretched between us. Marriage like load-bearing walls, you don't see the cracks until you test the weight. And by then, you're already wondering if the whole structure was compromised from the start. I've spent my career fixing cracked structures, I said finally. Reinforcing foundations, shoring up load-bearing walls that showed stress fractures. Pause. This time I need to know whether our foundation is still there, or whether we've been standing on nothing for years, whether the structure was ever sound, or whether I've just been too busy looking at blueprints to notice my own marriage was failing. She didn't answer. I placed the receiver down, gently, same as the door. No anger, just finality. 2 weeks later, I sat in Harold Templeton's office. The estate attorney who'd handled my professional contracts for 15 years spread the new will documents across his oak desk and adjusted his reading glasses. This transforms your intellectual property into permanent public infrastructure, he said, reading through the provisions. Conditional public license. Free use if safety protocols are followed. Cannot be sold or inherited corporately. Good, I said. That's what it was always supposed to be. The scholarship fund for underprivileged students studying structural engineering managed by your grandson Lyle. Yes, Ma and the house, the Oak Park property, becomes a free public building safety training center. I nodded. Lyle sat beside me, quiet. He'd understood when I explained it. Understood that some legacies matter more than inheritance. Your son won't receive anything, Harold noted carefully. My son stole what I built and broke it to save money. He doesn't need anything else from me. Harold made notes. Professional. Neutral. I'll have the final documents ready for signature next week. We left his office at 3:47 p.m. I stopped at the post office on the way home, mailed a box. Small. Cardboard. Addressed to Vernon's attorney's office, I didn't know where my son was living anymore. Inside one blueprint. Section I'd started in 2005. Never finished. Technical innovation I'd been developing when Vernon was 23, when I still thought we might collaborate someday. Load distribution system for earthquake-prone zones. Incomplete by design. Missing the calculations that would make it work. And a letter. Short. Handwritten. What you tried to take was never the money. It was the name on the drawing. but a name means nothing without the judgment behind it. I had hoped one day we would finish this together. You chose differently. Mailed the box the same day I signed the will. Blueprint we could have finished together, left incomplete on purpose so he'd know exactly what we lost. Not just the design, not just the patent, not just the recognition, the partnership, the collaboration, the chance to build something together that would outlast us both. Lyle drove me home. "Do you think he'll open it?" he asked. I looked out the window at Oak Park passing by. The neighborhood I'd lived in for 40 years. "I don't know," I said, because I didn't. Didn't know if Vernon would recognize what the incomplete blueprint meant. Didn't know if he'd understand the letter. Didn't know if he'd see it as closure or just another reminder of what he'd destroyed. Didn't know if Opal would call again. Didn't know if she'd understand why I couldn't come back to a foundation I no longer trusted. Didn't know what Vernon's criminal trial would look like. What sentence he'd face. Whether Roxanne's separate counsel strategy would work. Didn't know a lot of things, but I knew the will was signed. The scholarship fund established. The training center planned. My life's work transforming into something that couldn't be stolen or broken or claimed by someone who'd cut corners to save costs. Box was postmarked the same day I signed the will. Lyle said it was delivered to Vernon's attorney's office 48 hours later. Don't know if he ever opened it. 6 weeks later, 200 young engineers gathered in the house where I'd lived for 40 years and never been invited to dinner. Vernon had pled guilty to wire fraud and criminal endangerment 3 weeks earlier, taking a plea deal that spared him a longer sentence in exchange for full cooperation with the River North investigation. 18 months plus restitution he'd never fully pay. The Board of Engineers revoked his license the same week. The Prescott Building Safety Training Center opened on a Thursday morning in May. They'd gutted Vernon's mansion, ripped out the crystal chandeliers, and Italian marble replaced them with drafting tables and structural models and rows of steel-framed chairs. The dining room where I'd sat in my frayed collar became a lecture hall. The study where Vernon told me to know my place became an archive housing every inspection report I'd ever filed. Winston Caldwell stood at the podium in what used to be the foyer, addressing a crowd of engineering students and junior inspectors. The morning sun came through the tall windows, the same way it had that October night. But instead of illuminating expensive art, it fell across whiteboards covered in load calculations. Rufus Prescott spent his entire career saving structures everyone else had already condemned, Winston said. His voice carried the authority of someone who'd built his reputation on being right. He crawled through collapsed buildings when the fires were still smoking. He identified fatal flaws in designs that had been rubber-stamped by engineers with twice his credentials. He never asked for recognition, never demanded his name on anything he fixed. I stood in the back, watching young faces take notes. But the greatest lesson he left us isn't in any blueprint, Winston continued. He taught us that a structure cannot stand if the people who built it were dishonest. Neither can a family. The audience was silent. Some of them knew the story, how Vernon had stolen my work, how the River North investigation had exposed everything. Most of them just knew I was the old man who'd saved their profession from becoming a punchline. Winston looked directly at me. We named this center after him because he showed us that integrity isn't something you perform when convenient. It's the foundation you pour before anyone's watching. The applause started slowly, then built. I didn't move, didn't raise a hand or nod. Just stood there the way I'd stood in 1,000 buildings, checking if the structure would hold. When the ceremony ended, people wanted to shake my hand, ask questions, take photos. I answered what I could, kept my responses brief. These kids didn't need a speech about revenge or vindication. They needed to learn how to calculate wind loads and identify concrete degradation. Lyle appeared beside me as the crowd thinned. He'd lost weight since the trial. His expensive suit hung looser than it used to. "Dad," he said quietly. I waited. "Thank you," he said, "for not giving up on me." Before I could respond, a small hand slipped into mine. Stellan, wearing a miniature hard hat someone had given him, looked up at me with those serious brown eyes. "Grandpa, are you happy now? Now that everyone knows you're important?" I knelt down to his level joints, protesting but holding. The question deserved a real answer, not a deflection. "I don't need everyone to know I'm important," I said. "I need the people who matter to me to know what kind of man I am." Stellan thought about this for a moment, the way kids do when they're working through something bigger than the words they have for it. Then he smiled, not the performative smile kids give adults, but something genuine. "I always knew," he said. Something in my chest loosened. Not forgiveness that would take longer, and some things don't heal clean, but the beginning of something. A foundation you could build on if you were careful, if you did the work. Lyle put his hand on Stellan's shoulder. 3 generations standing in the doorway of a house that used to represent everything I'd been excluded from. "Come on," I said. "I'll show you the testing lab." We walked through together. Later, after everyone had left, I sat alone in what they were calling my office. They'd put my old drafting table in here, the one from my apartment, scarred and stained from 40 years of coffee cups and late nights. It looked out of place among the new furniture and updated equipment. On the wall, they'd framed one of my original River North sketches. The calculations I'd done in 2004 that Vernon had copied, refined, submitted under his name. The work that had launched his career and relegated me to building inspections. Next to it hung a photo from the Board of Engineers ceremony, where they'd revoked Vernon's license and restored my professional standing. I looked old in that picture, tired, but I was standing straight. I thought about that dinner in October, how Roxanne had pointed out my frayed collar, how Vernon had told me not to embarrass them, how they'd made it clear I didn't belong in their son's world. How I'd driven home in my pickup truck, knowing I was nothing to them but an inconvenience. A reminder of humble origins they'd spent 30 years trying to erase. This house, this enormous, ostentatious monument to Vernon's ego, now had my name on it. Young engineers would come here to learn the difference between structures that look impressive and structures that don't fall down. They'd study my work, my methods, my insistence on doing things right, even when no one was watching. Vernon had wanted his legacy to be buildings that touched the sky. Instead, his legacy was a son in prison and a license revoked for fraud. I stood, turned off the lights, locked the door behind me. The parking lot was empty except for my truck. The same one I'd driven that October night, still running, despite having 200,000 miles on it. Some things last because they're built right. Some things collapse because they weren't. I drove home thinking about foundations and failures, about what stands and what falls. They told me not to embarrass them at that dinner. Told me to know my place, told me I didn't belong in their son's world. Only thing that fell was everything they built on top of me. And to you listening to my story, remember, this silence isn't weakness, and patience isn't surrender. For 40 years I thought keeping the peace meant swallowing my pride. I thought love meant accepting humiliation. I believed that if I stayed quiet, worked hard, and never caused trouble, my family would eventually see my worth. Don't make my mistake. Your silence won't earn respect from people who've already decided you don't deserve it. Family justice doesn't always look like reconciliation. Sometimes it looks like boundaries. Sometimes it looks like walking away from the table where they made you feel small. What I learned is this: integrity outlasts ego every single time. The people who built their lives on stolen work, on lies, on making you feel worthless, they're building on sand. You're building on bedrock. God's timing taught me that vindication doesn't come from forcing people to see the truth. It comes from standing firm until the truth reveals itself. If you found yourself in Dad's revenge stories like mine, drop a comment and tell me what you'd have done differently. Would you have spoken up sooner or waited like I did? If this story resonated with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear that family justice is real even when it takes decades. And subscribe to Wise Revenge for more stories about standing firm. Thank you for staying until the very end. I know these dads' revenge stories can be heavy, but I hope the message stayed with you. As always, some details have been changed for privacy and storytelling. But the lesson at the heart of this about family justice and integrity, that's what I hope you carry forward.